Bom dia, meu nome é Breno Altman e está começando mais uma edição do programa 20 Minutos. Nossa convidada é Clara Mattei, professora associada no Departamento de Economia da New School for Social Research dos Estados Unidos, é autora do livro A Ordem do Capital, como economistas inventaram a austeridade e abriram caminho para o fascismo, publicado no Brasil pela editora Boitempo. Good morning, Ms. Mattei. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's an honor to have you on the 20 Minutes show.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me here.
First of all, Ms. Mattei, how could we summarize what an austerity policy means in economics?
Thank you. Before I answer this specific question, I want to say that I think part of how the austerity rationality has captured us is the fact that we can be so distant from the fact that there's a violent massacre of the Palestinian people going on as we speak. And there's hunger used and starvation used as a weapon of war. And my government, the United States, is sending war bombs and weapons to perpetuate this this disaster. And the austerity rationality is very compatible and I would say deeply intertailed with these attacks on civilians in Palestine and elsewhere. Indeed, austerity is not just about cutting the budget in general. It's about cutting social expenditures to use the resources of the taxpayer, of the people, of the American people, for example, to finance those who actually invest in arms, shareholders who are profiting immensely from all of the suffering of people in the world. Indeed, austerity is about prioritizing economic principles, the principles of profit making against people. It's indeed the best expression of how capitalism functions. The fact that we have economic priorities that are completely detached from people's fulfillment of need and actually depend on the suffering of people, both in the form of killing, but especially deeply in the form of economic exploitation. And what I mean by exploitation, I mean the fact that the majority of us around the world produce much more value than what we get in our paychecks. This means that we are not in control of the output of our labor, nor are we in control of the activity of our daily work. This is indeed what the majority is trapped in without any alternative, because if we need to survive under capitalism, once we become dependent on the market, meaning that we have to buy everything we need to survive, from food to shelter, medical cures. In the United States, it's everywhere. People become destitute because of their medical bills, right? Because medicine is also a commodity. So as schooling, the more market dependent we become, the more we have no alternative but to go and sell our capacity to work on the market for a low wage and be exploited in the technical sense of producing much more for the economy than what we get. And this is, in fact, the foundations of economic growth under capitalism. And it is what I call in the book, the capital order. The title of the book is exactly referring to the fact that our economic system is not at all spontaneous, natural, obvious, and the best possible system. Actually, it's a political order that is founded upon the subjugation of the majority of people, and thus needs to be actively protected and maintained alive through policies that we know as austerity policies. What austerity policies are all about, again, are about shifting resources away from people in favor of the few, the saving, investing few. So this you can do in a couple of ways. You can cut social expenditures. So again, public housing, schools, healthcare, you name it, anything around us becomes for sale. We can't just have it as humans. In the meantime, regressive taxation, meaning that taxes are being paid by the people, not by the rich, right? Actually, workers are paying way more taxes than those who actually make a living out of capital and out of accumulated wealth, right? And this is true everywhere in the world. The regressive taxation is the norm for austerity capitalism. While it is very easy to evade taxes or to not pay any inheritance tax, the workers pay a lot of taxes, also in the form of consumption taxes, meaning that if we want to buy bread or tobacco or all of the goods, we pay taxes. This is fiscal austerity. Fiscal austerity goes together with monetary austerity, something that all of us are familiar with, because for now 3 years, central banks have been increasing interest rates all over the world. What does it mean to increase interest rates? They tell us that it's to help us, to help the people, because we are solving inflation. What we find out, if we are critical and develop the lens that I tried to develop in the book, meaning the lens of critical political economy, is that actually increasing interest rates is not neutral. It's a policy that once more stabilizes money on the shoulders of the people. People have it harder to get money, to take money, to borrow money, but especially people lose their jobs because increasing interest rates slows down the economy and creates less job opportunities, and thus increases the unemployment rate. So more people are unemployed, the better it is for the system, because you can discipline workers into accepting lower wages. So I'm going to conclude now. We have fiscal monetary austerity. And then we have also the third element of what I call the austerity trinity that is everywhere, again, in advanced capitalist societies, both in the north and in the south of the globe, meaning industrial austerity. What is industrial austerity? It's about privatizations. It's about labor deregulation, so making labor more precarious, more flexible, attacking unions and other forms of workers' self-governance. This, of course, directly means that the state is intervening to curb the bargaining power of the workers, to make us weaker, more docile, and thus more trapped in the capital order. So once more, this austerity trinity is not just bad policy, unfortunately. We wish it was. The reality is that under capitalism, it is the best policy possible, because what we as humans think as problems, for example, unemployment, poverty, precariousness, are in fact solutions for our economic system, because they serve to protect the system from possible alternatives from emerging, from people realizing that actually they should have a much more of a say in their economic existence and economic agency. Instead, what happens is that austerity keeps us only worried about getting to the end of the month, only worried about paying rent, only worried about having to make it. And we hate our fellow workers because we are in competition with one another. And this creates a situation that is great for the rich, is great for profit accumulation, and for economic growth, generally speaking.
Ms. Mattei, would fascism or new fascism be inevitable consequences of the austerity policy?
The question you asked me is a crucial question that I have been researching. And I think the way I developed the question in the capital order in my book is slightly different from how it has been done before. What I want to show is not that fascism is the exception to the norm, but actually how fascism and capitalism are very much allies in preserving the capital order. So what I show in the book is that Benito Mussolini, the founding father of fascism that came to power in 1922, was loved by all of the economic elite, especially the liberal elite, for his capacity to actually suppress working class demands in a historical moment after the First World War, in which workers had gained a lot of bargaining power and a lot of political imagination to ask for alternative ways to organize society, to organize production and distribution. So in a moment in which workers all over, for example, Western Europe, were organizing with councils, both in the countryside and in factories, to claim economic democracy, this is what Mussolini was great at doing, was quashing workers' capacities to organize by directly implementing austerity. So austerity was very well done by Benito Mussolini because the state intervened directly, for example, to outlaw unions and to repress wages in a way that was even more radical than what was happening, for example, in Great Britain, in which the Bank of England and the Treasury were trying to do the same policies, but had to revert to the mediation of the market, meaning that they tried to basically increase interest rates. This is what they did. They increased interest rate so that they could cause a depression, and this ultimately had the effect of quashing workers. But let's say that fascism, especially in moments in which workers are most embattled, is the best companion or the best political regime, let's put it, for capitalism to function in order indeed to preserve the pillars of our capitalist economy, namely wage relations and private property of the means of production. Once Mussolini came to power, the expectations for profits of investors, both within Italy and outside, grew immensely. So that actually foreign capital was again attracted to Italy. Investors started coming in and the country grew economically while the population was suffering low wages, precariousness, and the privatization of all resources. So this is how we can understand it historically. Now, the question you ask is tricky because we also know that right now, as we speak, many authoritarian, right-wing, call it fascist governments, if you like, have grown exactly because austerity has been very successful in the last decades or more in making people more vulnerable and more individualistic. So people have bought into the logic of austerity and the narrative of economists who tell us that if we're poor, it's our fault and we should actually blame the poorest. So that actually people think that these governments may represent an alternative to what has made them suffer until that point, right? So in a way, in my country, in Italy, the reason why Giorgia Meloni came to power and she recognized she is explicitly in the legacy of Benito Mussolini is because people saw in her someone who would do something different from the liberal technocratic elite that governed before her. Now, guess what? She did nothing different and actually did more austerity by fundamentally even cutting the very little money the poor families were getting, called the citizenship income. Okay, so austerity, once again, with authoritarian governments can be even more powerful. But I do think that the fact that there's a lot of right-wing governments emerging speaks to the fact that all governments from the left and for the right in the last decades have implemented austerity, created a situation of impoverishment, not just material, but also in the political awareness and imagination of people. Now, this does not mean, and this for me is very important because I go against a lot of my colleagues who tell me, oh, it's the end of history. We can't imagine anything else outside of capitalism. This is the opposite message I wanted to give. I want to give the message that actually fascist governments are coercive because people have the tendency to constantly actually mobilize against the system. So even if austerity keeps hitting and it hits hard and it individualizes us, the reality is that alternatives are always present. And this is why, for example, in this historical moment, the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, and many other banks around the world have increased the interest rates because they're worried about workers getting together, trying to change things. And this is what has been happening in the United States as we speak. Workers have won many battles. We don't talk about this, but actually many battles have been won by unions in the United States. New unions are emerging. Workers are claiming a share of the GDP like never before. And this is the moment in which austerity hits again, bites hard, as a way to protect the capital order. So the message here is, of course, fascism, a great ally to capitalism. Again, fascism, not an exception, but actually not something different from capitalism, but actually the best expression of it. But at the same time, the fact that this does not mean that we can't consider our economy as a political object that thus can continue to change and people can actively participate in changing it.
Ms. Mattei, even among those countries that did not go to fascism, would there be a structural contradiction between democracy and capitalism?
Thank you. This is really the core of the message of my book. It is the message that says if we take history seriously and we actually study the history of our capitalist economic system, instead of idealizing it, we actually go and look how it operated through time and how it evolved. We realize that a core element of how the capital order is maintained is through what I call the de-democratization of the economic sphere. We can call it depoliticization, but really it's de-democratization, meaning that what needs to be done is to expel people from deciding on fundamental economic decisions, namely monetary and fiscal policies, because people, of course, will not vote in favor of austerity, given that austerity is favorable to the logic of capitalism, but unfavorable to the logic of human needs, and actually oppressive of the logic of human needs. So what we have seen through time is that even in non-explicitly fascist context, liberal democracies have slowly insulated the most important economic decisions away from democratic processes. This is indeed what central banks, independent central banks, are all about. Independent central bank is not a norm. We take it as natural and for granted because this is what we're used to. But actually, historically, independent central banks were exported. Actually, in Brazil, the central bank as independent was exported from the technocrats that I study in my book, from the treasury, the British treasury. So really an element also of economic imperialism to all of these countries elsewhere, to tell them the only way you're going to be able to do prudent finances and keep inflation in check is if you avoid people from intruding into economic processes. So this is fundamental, that if you understand what the logic of capitalism is all about, you understand that there's a tension, and I would say actually a very big contradiction between democracy and capitalism. Of course, by democracy here, I mean substantive democracy. I don't just mean going to vote at the elections once every 4 years or whatever it is. Of course, democracy, electoral democracy, emerged historically with capitalism. The point is that electoral democracy is often hiding much more substantial ways in which the system is non-democratic, because we have no say about what most matters in our lives, meaning our economic conditions as human beings.
You explain in your book how austerity was consolidated as the main solution to the capitalism crisis after the First World War. But was this, within capitalism, the only possible solution? Don't Roosevelt's New Deal in the 30s and the so-called Keynesian period after the Second World War demonstrate that capitalism has enough flexibility to also adopt expansionist path supposedly opposed to austerity?
Thank you. This is actually, again, these questions are wonderful. This is very important. This is exactly why in my historical work as a historical political economist, I'm trying to re-narrate the history of macroeconomic policies of the 20th and 21st century. So what I'm trying to show is that actually austerity capitalism is the norm, and that austerity is in the DNA of the very functioning of our economic system. Again, because it serves to maintain the proper class balance in favor of the few and against the many working classes that is required for healthy capital accumulation, meaning economic growth. So this is, of course, a lens that then tells us that what was exceptional instead was what happened with the New Deal, right? So that actually what happened with the New Deal, and potentially in few years after the Second World War, and this is what I'm actually trying to dismantle in my next book, but anyway, we can still say that in very few countries, and especially, for example, the dominant country that is imposing austerity everywhere else, okay, the United States, few years of the history of the United States saw, in fact, policies that were more expansionary. Now, I would say that this is the exception that requires very specific historical conditions. For example, the hegemonic role of the United States that could export everywhere else. For example, the fact that productivity was increasing in that historical moment so that profits could be maintained high even if wages were going up. Okay, so productivity meant that the rate of exploitation was still high because workers were producing more value in less time, and this was compatible with higher wages. But really, if we look at the history of capitalism, the norm is that the way you maintain profitability is through wage repression. So I would say that in certain moments, of course, the political pressure from below can lead the capitalist state to take on measures that are not about austerity, okay? And this is, of course, the fact that there's nothing fixed. It's all political relation. The economic decisions are political decisions. So if there is enough political pressure, there may be something that is not austerity, but these non-austerity reforms may be very dangerous for the capitalist system. You know what happened in the early 70s? Exactly this, right? After years of non-austerity, this allowed workers to gain enough rights to mobilize again and ask for a different economic order, right? And indeed, the 70s are a moment of heightened class struggle in which there is a lot of efforts to break away from the system. Even remember Salvador Allende in Latin America, for example, right? Or in Italy also, many working councils, many demands to break away from capitalism. So this is the trick, is that if the capitalist state is pressured from below to implement non-austerity measures, this may have dangerous political consequences for the system because people may realize that alternatives are possible and ask to break away from the trap of the capital order. So again, why it is better for the system to keep going with austerity, and why indeed these moments of more progressive policies are rare, and when they are around, they may destabilize politically the system.
Was the existence of the Soviet Union and the socialist camp one of the possible reasons for this anti-austerity accession?
Yes, I think this is really important, right? Because to understand why in certain moments capitalist states would do something that is not directly austerity, we need to understand that political pressure doesn't only come from within countries, but also from the geopolitical context. Galileo, va tutto bene. From the geopolitical context. So this means fundamentally that having the threat of an alternative that was working, like the Soviet Union, meant a lot for the United States. And not for nothing, as soon as the Berlin Wall fell, they were capable of implementing the same austerity capitalism also in the ex-Soviet Union. And this led to an easier path towards what we call neoliberalism, which I would prefer to call austerity capitalism. That means that in the United States right now, we have 63% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck, meaning that if they, for some reason, have to undertake an emergency, that could be, for example, a medical emergency, they can end up in the street, they end up in poverty. In New York City, where I live, it's one of the richest cities in the world. There are the most amount of millionaires in the world. And there's also half the population that is in poverty or low income. 1 out of 4 children in the United States is poor for official statistics, which of course we know tend to actually, underplay the actual conditions. So this is the point, right? Is that actually homelessness, precariousness, destitution, this is the norm under capitalism. Of course, if there are alternatives around, this may help the political pressure to slightly modify things. And the fall of the Soviet Union was a great hit for the ruling elite in the West, because they then had way less political pressure to keep convincing us that the only and best possible world is our economic system. But I think right now we are in a moment in which people are not buying it anymore. Everyone is aware that this system is completely irrational for the very preservation of humankind. It's a system that creates an amount of violence and desperation, of mental health issues and all sorts of oppression that we really need to start thinking outside of the box. And I think this is why history is important, is because if you take history seriously, you realize that there are a lot of moments in which there were real alternatives, not just in the abstract, but actually taking place.
Ms. Mattei, when Joe Biden took office as President of the United States in January 2021, he announced an ambitious state investment program in addition to tax changes that increased the contribution of the richest. There were sectors of the left that analyzed his economic policy proposal as revolutionary and welcomed the end of the neoliberal era of capitalism. Do you agree with this interpretation?
No, and I think this is why I have a lot of trouble with many of my colleagues, economists, that tell you that they are progressive and that they want social change. I think the profession is so corrupt that also those who deem themselves as progressive economists are often there to hide how things are actually working, to conceal, to make us stupider and more gullible about what is happening. And part of the narrative of the so-called left is that Joe Biden is a great solution to the problems in the United States. Joe Biden has shown how the Democratic Party is the most hypocritical and complicit in preserving the capital order. So none of the social measures that were supposedly, promised were passed. And now you can blame this or this senator from the Republican Party, but I'm sorry, the reality is that there's no political will to go against the logic of austerity and to actually use taxpayer money to help out those who are in need and to actually give money to the working classes. What Joe Biden has been able to do is only to approve of the Federal Reserve's increases in interest rates, and especially fund like crazy the military industrial complex by increasing the profits of the shareholders in the military industry, and thus doing the disaster that he is doing in Gaza, killing thousands of children, almost 15,000 at this point, not to mention all of those who are literally starving. So I'm sorry, I think this narrative about Bidenomics as being different from austerity is dangerous and it's detrimental to change. We need to realize that Bidenomics is a different form of austerity, is more hypocritical, is more hidden, but has not changed to the slightest the conditions of workers in the United States. What is changing the conditions of workers in the United States is exactly what Biden is trying to avoid, which is the fact that indeed what they say is the labor market is tight, namely that we are in a moment in which there are much more job openings than people willing to go to work, right? So this is what has changed the conditions, is the fact that actually workers had gained in bargaining power because of the market being favorable to the workers. This is something that the Biden administration with the Fed is actively trying to change by monetary austerity combined with fiscal austerity and cutting social resources to weaken the workers, even if they pretend, of course, to be with the workers. But we want to remember that Biden was actually stopped, for example, the railway strike this summer in the United States by law. So it's something that Mussolini would do, use the law to actually tell railway workers they cannot strike for the national good. This is a measure that is quite oppressive and has been done by the Democratic Party.
Have left and center-left governments in Europe and Latin America been able to implement economic policies opposed to austerity, even within the capitalist system?
I think this is the problem, that in Europe, we have not witnessed the right or the left have been doing austerity policies for too long. And this is why people are very, very upset, and why then again, the parties in government use the scapegoat of the, scare of immigration as their way to tell people we are with you, right? To try to block immigration from coming in, which is completely a myopic stance to take. And this is something that unfortunately means that I think in order for there to be real changes, we need to rethink the left. We really need to rethink the left deeply. And again, though, I think in order to rethink the left, we need to rethink the relation of capitalism with austerity. And this is something that requires a deeper understanding of how our system operates. And this is what I really hope people, from academics to students to workers to people in government, start seeing, right? How the system is not that flexible. And if we do want to do stuff that are not austerity, we need to push against the logic of the system with the repercussions, If your government decides to do something that, for example, is about progressive taxation, there will be a lot of repercussions at the international level. You will lose capital. Capital fights will happen. You will lose in credibility from part of the international markets. So this is the point, is that any government that does want to do something that is not austerity will face serious levels of opposition from the part of the material pressures of the financial and economic world we're in. So this is where, again, I think that the reality is that we have to realize that any economic policy is a political choice and it comes with consequences. But I do think that there is space to rethink the fundamentals of our economy if we do start, for example, implementing seriously redistributive measure. That is one step in the direction of thinking about an alternative.
In the past, the social democratic parties weren't able to establish with the welfare state policy an alternative to austerity, even within the capitalism system?
Well, I think that goes back to the question also before. And I think again, there's different ways in which austerity can be more or less explicit. But I would say that any party in government that tries to maintain market confidence high, more or less has to revert to austerity. So, there are measures that, right now, for example, the stimulus package that Europe is giving supposedly for the post-COVID recovery. Everyone says, oh, this is a new form of Keynesianism. This is something different. If you look at where the money is spent, is once more spent not for the people, but for big investors, right? Asset managers who want to come in and lead the transition to a green economy, the big infrastructures, big again private investors in technological enterprises. So this is not counter to the logic of austerity, right? It's the state actually subsidizing the usual suspects. Just to be clear, I'm not trying to say that all of the history of capitalism and all the different phases of different governments in different countries are the same. That would be stupid. What I am trying to say, though, is that we should be, I think, more attentive to the similarities that often are hidden purposefully, because highlighting them is problematic for the ruling elite. But part of what preserves the consensus for the system is to give us this false impression of economic pluralism, of the idea that if you pick between the two parties, you will see substantial differences in how the economy is managed. What a Marxian political economist will tell you is that overall, whoever is in government within capitalism has to maintain as a priority that of preserving the capital order. So the margins of what you can do in terms of resources for people, in terms of decommodification and increases of the commons, and actually prioritizing human needs over political requirements is very, very slim. Okay, so I think this is a message that needs to be taken seriously, that capitalism is compatible with only certain forms of political organizations and political priorities. So this is very, very important, I think. So this doesn't mean that there's not differences, but I think that we need to be attentive to the similarities. And once more, the last thing I would like to say on this is that this is why we also, and the whole purpose of my work has been about rethinking the logic and the definition of austerity. Once more, austerity is not what you read if you look at any encyclopedia or any mainstream media about budget cuts and tax increases. Austerity is about where the state decides to spend and who the state decides to tax. So the fact that the state is spending a lot of money and you see a lot of debt being created and a lot of deficit, this does not mean that the state is not doing austerity. It means that potentially it's using a lot of resources once more to subsidize, to de-risk the private investors who, in our economic system, are those who should be leading the economy, right? And so this, I think, is very important, is that austerity is about class relations, not about the aggregate. If we look at the aggregate, we might not see austerity. There's something more to be said.
Is capitalism nowadays less flexible than in the past when happened this kind of concession, this kind of exception you have told us before?
I don't know if we could say it's less flexible. I would say it was not that flexible at the time either. And that's why I would like to relook at that history and say, well, actually, austerity was lingering. It was just not made obvious by historians. I would say that definitely we are in a moment in history in which crises of overproduction and falling profitability in the long term are heightened. And so indeed, the financialization made possible the fact that there is not real immediate interest in investing in the real economy for profit making in the first place. So this ultimately also means that I think the capitalist state is much more dependent on what we could call the rentier class. And this makes it such that in austerity is even more obvious as the only way forward, right? So I think that's also important, is to see in different historical moments which sectors of the capitalist class are actually in a way dominating. And perhaps that means that politically certain measures are definitely more taboo than they were once, if that makes sense. But I think here it's where it's important to also keep in mind the role of economic theory in this conversation. This has been a lot of my work, has been about looking at what type of economic ideas and models were backing austerity policies. And in that sense, you see that these have not changed at all since actually the early 20s and 30s. We have variations of Keynesianism that though have been completely incorporated within the neoclassical framework. And ultimately, they all tell us that in policy terms, austerity is the way forward.
In political terms, is it possible, in your opinion, to come back to the golden welfare state years? Is it possible within capitalism to go back to that economical and social period?
Yes, thank you. This is important. No, I don't think it's possible. And also what I think is that this golden period was not golden in the first place. So this is actually what I'm doing in my current project, is to dismantle the idea that the golden age of capitalism was qualitatively different from austerity capitalism. I don't think this is the case historically, neither in policy making terms nor in terms of economic theory. It could be that workers that in that specific historical moment had greater bargaining power because of a variety of reasons that we don't have time to investigate. But I do think that the idea that is kind of in the air for many progressive economists of thinking that the solutions are to idealize the past and try to revert to a form of welfare state as it was in the 50s and 60s, this is A, misguided, B, limiting of political imagination. So the idea that the only way out is to revert to something of the past that was actually fetishized and never existed is, I think, the problem of so-called progressive economists, because they're denying the political, at once political and economic limits. And again, political and economic for me are inseparable, because our economic system is a political system, meaning based on the fundamental political relation of exploitation, right? And this is very political. So the political and economic imagination is blocked if we think that the only option we have is to go back in time to something that never was. We need to be courageous to see what it means for us to live under capitalism in terms of impossibility of actually really resolving our depredation of the resources in the planet, or really resolving the fact that the majority in the world are suffering in all possible ways, and realize that we need instead to have a much more consciously political attitude towards economic decisions. And we need to claim a space for us in this process, right? So the conscious and political element of economic decision needs to emerge, and needs to be emerge in a way that is forward-looking, not backward-looking, and realistic, not idealistic. Because otherwise, this is why progressive economists then end up justifying, ultimately, and falling in the same camp as their austerity colleagues, because both of them tell us there's no alternatives to capitalism. Well, I don't think this is true. I think now it's more than ever the case for people to mobilize for something different. Now, this does not mean that the only alternatives is what happened in the Soviet Union or in China or whatnot, because actually, if you investigate that history too, much of these countries maintained exploitation as a social relation of production. In the Soviet Union, the capitalist class was demolished because indeed the state was the owner of the means of production. So of course, private property of the means of production was demolished, yet the relation of exploitation was not. So in a way, I think history can also show us how these alternatives that emerged were problematic. And this doesn't mean that we can't learn and be courageous enough to ask for something different. And I think this is why ultimately thinking seriously about workers' self-management is very important, and how this can also help us get rid of our dependence on money and on ultimately on the value form that oppresses us in such a way.
Ms. Mattei, in the introduction of to the Brazilian edition of your book, you analyze that even in the almost 14 years of PT government in Brazil, an austerity policy would have prevailed. But in this period, I would ask our production to put the graphic on the screen. But in this period, from 2003 to 2016, the labor income share rose from 31.4% to 35.6% of gross domestic product, as shown in the graph on the screen, while the profit share fell from 34.1% to 32.3%. Wouldn't these numbers be contradictory to an austerity policy?
So this is very interesting, and I thank you for this data, because actually I think that the first thing, if we want to be critical political economists to do, is actually to look at exactly these types of data, right? To actually look at what is called class shares. What portion of the total GDP of the economy goes to capital and what goes to labor? And that is very indicative of the political relations at play and where capitalism stands in a certain moment. And I would say that the higher the labor share, the more in danger the capital order is. And again, this might sound counterintuitive, because a lot of Marxists have pushed for the accelerationist version, which is actually if you make people poorer, then people will revolt. I would say the opposite, right? Actually, what you see is that in moments in which workers have increased their bargaining power, those are the moments that are potentially existentially threatening to the system. And this is something that we have seen historically. Now, this is very interesting, and it would be very important to analyze what are the factors that allowed for the increase of the labor share. And I'm pretty sure that state policies had to do with this, right? So I think it would be very important to understand what state policies actually at least helped the labor share go up. What I do think, though, is that this is not necessarily indicative of the fact that there hasn't been any tendency for the Brazilian state, like many other states, to adhere to the general austerity logic, right? To actually potentially avoid doing serious redistributive measures and do the minimum, but ultimately keep alive the fact that the priority for the state is capital accumulation, which means that you can't increase taxes of the rich too much. You can't increase the taxes of corporations too much, because then you risk capital flights. You cannot nationalize too much, because we need actually to, again, maintain a solid share of the economy in the hands of private entrepreneurs and to deregulate labor. So these type of policies, I think, are quite lingering in the past years. And even if I don't know with precision too much about the Brazilian case, and actually that the preface, I was very happy to work with Mariella Pittari, who's a scholar, PhD scholar from Brazil, who knows much more than me. So we worked on that together. So it'd be nice to have her take on it. But what I'm trying to say is that I think we have to keep separate the labor relations from the tendency of the capitalist state to implement austerity. And these, of course, austerity policies do impact labor relations, but they're still can be maintained as separate points of analysis.
If the left should, in your opinion, break with the policy of austerity, what could be the alternative? In fact, would an alternative be possible as long as the left does not once again have the target and its strength to overcome the capitalist regime? Is it possible an alternative to the police of austerity inside the capitalism system, or the left should propose another kind of system once again?
Yeah, thank you. I think the problem here is that the left has really lost touch with the condition. The political left in government is often way too separate from the actual conditions of the majority of their population. So that's why ultimately they can think that our capitalist system is indeed compatible with a better future for people. I do think that a change can happen if those in government, with, of course, the pressure from below, because it won't, again, happen spontaneously, can push for non-austerity policies, for serious social distribution, for serious progressive taxation, for serious collectivization of resources, for serious protection of labor rights. These policies will by definition not be compatible with the logic of the system. So this is the whole point, is that we need the courage as human beings to use our collective action to shift the boundaries of what is normal, so that we can actually start problematizing what we usually take for granted, our economic system. If there is a way for governments to implement non-austerity policies, these will be policies that will shake the fundamentals of the capital order, and thus require certain further movement in a direction that is post-capitalist. If we try to remain within, what is going to happen is that we're going to have a huge relapse and a huge attack from the part of the ruling classes, again, in the form of economic blackmail, right? Again, like the country being completely isolated economically and bashed by the markets, and just like the escape of all possible wealth from the country. These are serious possibilities, but I think if there is the courage, then one is able to actually withstand this blackmail, because we need to breach our market dependence. People need to find the resources so as to not be dependent on the market. And this is true both for people and for countries at large. And this requires a huge amount of political courage with consequences. But I think this is the only way in which we can start having priorities that are for the people, so that you start realizing that we need, for example, to produce and distribute locally. We need to produce and distribute through cooperatives or to workers-led organizations. There is a lot of wealth that can be created by people getting together and actually sharing how to take care of their basic needs, especially in countries like Brazil that are full of also of important natural resources. These could be taken care of democratically and be the source for an actual economic democracy. So this seems insane. And again, I don't think we can talk about this in the abstract. Things need to happen first. This is the big point also that Marx was making, is that, I can't provide a template of what a post-capitalist society would look like. This will happen as you struggle, right? This is the important lesson that you get also from my book that studies the case of Antonio Gramsci after 1919 and the occupation of the factories in Italy and the council movement, is that in the council movement, alternatives and possibilities were emerging as people were participating in a different way to run production. So we can't say this in the abstract. It's not the role of me or of any scholar to kind of sit in their chair and imagine a possible future. The point is, we need to break away from the illusions that, again, have us think that the system is natural and immovable, so that once we get this courage to actually start demanding for more. And this demand can come from in a way that pressures those in government, but it can also come in directly mobilizing, I think, to breach our market dependence ourselves. And it's also only here, as these things happen, that we can actually start seeing what then is possible. But until we try, and we keep thinking that actually Keynesianism is an alternative that is possible within the system, and Keynesianism is something different from austerity capitalism, I think we're just fooling ourselves. And this is why I think it's important to have new ways of understanding the history of capitalism. And this is where, in a way, I tried to put my effort, and I hope I gave at least a small contribution in this direction.
Should the left, in your opinion, think and talk back again about revolution?
Yes, I think the word has been appropriated by the ruling elite in a way that everyone hears it and like is frightened. A revolution does not mean bloodshed and barbarism, right? The fact that we associate revolution to that is already problematic of the fact that we have internalized the rhetoric of the end of history that has been perpetuated by technocrats all over the world, especially by economists. Okay, so this is very important. Revolution means structural and fundamental change, and revolution is an objective, again, of actually overcoming the oppressive pillars of our economy, but it can be achieved in many different ways, right? In Britain, in the book, I talk about all of the revolution by constitutional means that was being actually put into place in Britain in 1919, right? They were actually using legislative bodies to think about indeed nationalizing coal, for example, and having workers manage coal production. This had no bloodshed involved. It was actually about pushing the limits of what is possible within the political confines. Now, is that enough? Is that not enough? Again, that is something that history will tell us. But I do think that the whole point is that revolution is a positive thing. Now, counter-revolution is a negative thing, and counter-revolution can be also very violent. But revolution itself is a very important and
usually much more violent than the revolution.
Exactly. So yes, it's enough to think about what happened in Chile with Pinochet. So I think this is really important, is that we need to think of the word in a positive sense and use it without fear, because it means ultimately human liberation against the capital order.
Ms. Mattei, we're coming to the end of our conversation. I'd like to ask you a question that I always present to our guests. What book, film, or series could you recommend to those who follow us?
So I would like to recommend a book that I was gifted with by my colleague, Flavio Henriquez, a book actually only in Brazilian Portuguese right now, not in English. I hope it will come in English soon, because it's a book that tells you exactly about these alternatives that are real and existing, and ultimately the source of potential serious revolutionary economic change. And again, revolutionary in the sense of empowering people and stop having an economy that works against the people through people's exploitation, an economy that said is for the people and thus managed by the people. And I think these examples that he gives about Brazilian and Argentinian actually businesses run by workers is very, very inspiring, and brings in a way to the present day what I have done a little bit in my book, which tell the story of these types of council movements in 1919. We see that they never stop, and they're part of our life still today as we speak. We just need to learn about them and in a way support these alternatives.
And I would like to recommend ORDEM do CAPITAL by Ms. Clara Mattei. It's one of the most important books in the last years. We have a Brazilian edition by Boitempo, and I would like to tell everybody to go to a bookshop, a digital or physical bookshop, and buy this book. It's very, very important. Ms. Mattei, I would like to thank you very much for your time and for this very important conversation, accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much. Before we go, can you read the title of this book out loud? Because I was too embarrassed given my bad Portuguese.
Autogestão em empresas recuperadas por trabalhadores. Esse livro foi escrito por Flávio Chedi Henriques. Eu não consigo ver o nome da editora, mas enfim, o título do livro eu vou repetir aqui: Autogestão em empresas recuperadas por Trabalhadores, de Flávio Chedin Hicks.
Thank you.
This is the indication, the recommendation
Wonderful,
by
because
Clara
I was
Mattei.
embarrassed by my bad pronunciation.
Just
Okay.
right. The problem is with gestão. It's very
Gestão, exactly.
it's hard to pronounce. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And apologies to the audience for the background noise of my child Galileo. I hope it wasn't disturbing. Okay.
It's part of the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Também agradeço a todos e todas que assistiram a esse programa, em especial aqueles que puderam fazer contribuições financeiras ao nosso site e ao canal de Opera Mundi no YouTube. Sem vocês, nosso trabalho não seria possível e não faria sentido. Um grande abraço a todos e a todas.